Okay, we're back for 2019 with the New Zealand Aviation Podcast. I hope everybody had a good break. If you actually had a break, I didn't have a break. What about you, Martin? Happy New Year. Did you have a break?
Yeah, sort of. I went to East Timor.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's interesting. Quickly describe that. What happened?
It was a lot more authentic than I was anticipating.
Oh.
Yeah, it was interesting. It wasn't quite what I was expecting. The people were lovely. East Timor itself, less.
What were you expecting?
I don't know. I was expecting probably a bit more tropical islandy.
Oh, okay.
Because it is in the tropics and it is an island. But
yes.
yeah. But it wasn't really like that. Strange place. US dollar is the currency. Things are quite expensive. There's really not much there in terms of infrastructure. Flew over on a very nice Air North Embraer E175.
Oh, yeah?
Yep, that was good. Yeah, had a really good time, but it was more interesting than I was expecting, I think.
Okay, what were the facilities sort of crude?
Yeah, like to the point of almost non-existent at times.
I was picking that up in the tone in your voice. Okay, but it's always good to go and experience a new place, right? So whatever.
Oh, no, it was great fun.
Because they've had a hell of a history. Poor things.
Yes. Well, yeah, when you look into the history, there is a lot of poor things, but we maybe talk about this not on the show. It is actually, that's very interesting, the history. Spent quite a lot of time in the museum and talking to some of the people that have been through it all. I feel really sorry for them. Yeah,
well, I remember at the time when they were severely dealt to right at the end there by the Indonesians. Anyway, like you say, another story, not really for the aviation discussion. At the end of this podcast, remember last year, Martin, I said that we'd be doing more interviews and trying to get more people involved. Well, we're going to do that in this podcast. At the end of our talk, we're going to be hearing from Andrew Russell, who's a Kiwi and has written a book on a Continental Airlines crash back in the early 60s, I think 62. The flight was Continental Flight 11, and needless to say, it blew up and landed in a field in rural Iowa. So we'll have the story on that and why Andrew wrote the book and how, he's come into contact with many people who were involved with the people, descendants of the people who were involved in that incident at the time. So that'll be at the end of the podcast, but plenty to talk about in this new first up episode for 2019, Martin. We're back to MH370, okay?
Yeah.
All right, so I don't know if you saw this story. A few weeks ago, 17th of Jan, it was reported here anyway in the New Zealand Herald, and I'm sure around the world, that a fisherman claims he saw the Malaysian Airlines plane go down, and he's apparently given the coordinates, the GPS coordinates, to the authorities, investigators, to follow up. Rushley Cushman, who's 42, says he and his crew members witnessed the disaster. I saw the plane moving from left to right like a broken kite, he said. He recalled seeing a damaged aircraft and thick black smoke. There was no noise, just black smoke as a result of fires before it crashed into the water. There was a strong smell of acidic fumes in the air before the plane went down. So that was quite a big news conference back then. He did not explain why it had taken almost 5 years for him to report his version of the events to authorities. And the location is in the Malacca Strait, the north end of the Malacca Strait, he's saying, is the location of where he saw the plane go down into the water. 5 years. He sat on it for 5 years. Would you do that? Would we do that?
Well, no. No, that is interesting, isn't it? Did he sit on it, or did he just tell the locals and it never got out? I don't know.
Not reported with that sort of clarity. I can't really say.
Yeah.
But a plane on fire, well, what our theory is, or the theories we've talked about over the years, and that does involve a plane being on fire. But if a plane flies around uncommanded for a period of time, it probably isn't going to end up on fire, is it?
No, but I mean, you remember there were those early model 777s where oxygen fires in the cockpit were not 100% impossible.
No, well, almost an exact model suffered that fate, luckily on the ground. Yes. I guess you could still be flying and burning if that had happened. But if he has coordinates, surely they'll follow them up. They'll go have a look. You'd have to, wouldn't you?
Well, one would expect so. Yeah, go and have a look. How much is it going to cost? And given the amount of money they spent so far and got nothing.
If someone had told me all those years ago now, because it's a long time ago, pretty well, and that time's gone quite quick, it seems to me. But if someone had told me all those years ago that this would still be a mystery now, I would have said to them, oh, no, they would have figured it out by then.
Amazing, isn't it? Yes, I would never have thought it would have lasted this long either. That is quite astounding.
And you've heard of other, there's been a few other stories.
Yes, there's the old one cropping up where some guy's convinced that the pilot was up to something and that he spent months and months practicing avoiding radar on his flight simulator.
Well, first of all, how can you do that?
Well, that was going to be my question. You must have a very, very sophisticated flight simulator that's showing you where the radar is.
Yeah, and that you're actually avoiding it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that you're actually avoiding it. This story keeps coming up. It just seems a lot of people are 100% convinced that the pilot was up to no good.
One thing that's interested me through this whole process, and being a media person myself, I guess, is that that no one sort of keeps a check on some of these wild stories. People just seem to accept them as entirely possible. When you start thinking it through, not so much. And they keep coming up again and again. You've got smart people, supposedly, authors, almost claiming to be inside the head of these pilots. I mean, you can't be.
These are the same aviation journalists who have a headline, Air New Zealand late into Queenstown, and then show you a picture of a old Air New Zealand DC-10 landing in Dallas.
Yeah. I know. Now, I used to complain. Now I don't even bother complaining. There's no point.
Yeah. I mean, there was that recently a story about Air New Zealand, and it showed a 747 in like late 80s, early 90s livery. I thought, okay.
You have to wonder what goes on in the brain of the, journalist?
Well, I thought, even when I saw that photo, and it was only a week or two ago, I thought, where did they even get that photo? Because that wouldn't have been the first photo that came up in a search on the Googles.
Well, you'd think they'd have their own database if they're a big news organisation. They've been taking pictures of planes for years.
Maybe they shouldn't in that case.
I think that they should just put a picture of the right flyer in every time.
Yeah.
And be done with it.
Yeah. Or a kid's picture of an airplane, generic aircraft. Yeah.
But getting back to MH370, there's a certain sensationalist angle to that story, and news organisations like to dig it up every now and then. There are people out there who know that news organisations like that for click-throughs, so they'll come up with, just like, as you mentioned, those sorts of headlines, and the old story keeps coming, every 9 months, a year it comes up, doesn't it, that one?
Yeah. Pop up, yeah.
And
yeah.
people
I'd say every few months.
And people who seem to be claiming that they are inside the head of these people, that they know what they did. I mean, how could you ever know that? And people accept it. Oh, yeah, it must be that way. Yeah. Oh, yeah, the flight simulator. Yeah. Well, do you know anything about flight simulators? No. Well, how do you... our first question is, how do you simulate dodging radar on your Microsoft Flight Sim?
Yeah.
But I hope they follow up that sighting if he's got coordinates, and they go look, and maybe they'll find something. Who knows?
Hopefully.
Looking at the local scene, Martin, Air New Zealand not so punctual. The OAG, what's the OAG? They measure 58 million flight records over a full year of data, and rank the airlines for on-time performance. And according to its rankings, Air New Zealand drops out of the top 10 for the Asia-Pacific region for the first time, with a 76.70% of the flights on time during the year. Previous score was 81.33%, so they're not in the top 10. Qantas, who have been named the safest airline in the world, by the way, by the same organisation, they came in with 85.65% on time. So Air New Zealand slipping not so good. Spending too much time on safety videos and not enough time on getting away on time.
I've noticed when my recent flights with Air New Zealand that they are invariably late departing, although they tend to get in roughly on time. And I wonder if on Trans-Tasman that's due to the way the slots are handled. So they can't come in early because, they schedule a flight for 4 hours and 10 minutes, but it's never 4 hours and 10 minutes. It's always like 3 hours and 40, 3 hours and 20. And so to avoid getting in early, because maybe the Aussies won't let them land, or the airports here are so congested, there is no place for them to go. You sit on the tarmac in Auckland or wherever for 20 minutes. Although I must say, we very rarely sit on the plane for very long. You generally just board 20 minutes late.
Yeah. I guess they've got ways of sort of dampening down the perception of a delay.
Yeah.
By doing things at particular times, yeah.
Yeah, it would be nice to get in early for a change, but that never happens. Well, a few minutes, but never the 40 minutes that you could have been.
Well, Jetstar's not too far behind on 75.99%.
Yeah.
And Brazilian carrier Azul is the most non-on-time airline in the top 10. So
you've dealt with Brazil, haven't you? So no surprises there.
Yeah. But that's Needleman, or was.
Yeah.
Top 10 airlines, Copa Airlines 1, Air Baltic 2. We hear a lot about Air Baltic. They're a real star, aren't they?
Yes, and they're doing very, very, very well with their CS300 or the A320.
What do you got from Australia? Anything?
Well, I have more of a question. I see British Airways have announced plans to retire all of their 747-400s by 2022, I believe.
Wow, that's not far away.
2024. So the unrefurbished ones will all be gone within the next 2 years, and then after that they'll start winding down all the recently refurbished models. I think they've got 34 of them, and they're all going to be gone by 2024, which leads me to the question, Qantas, they're still running a few 747s. I wonder for how much longer?
Well, not much longer, you would think.
No.
What would they replace it with, though? That's the thing.
Well, this is the thing that we haven't been hearing about. Yeah,
777X.
I'll follow that up because.
Well, it would either be the 777X, which has about the same capacity, I think, over the same range or near enough, or it would be the A350, 1000?
Probably, yeah. We'll see where they go. I'll follow that up because that's quite interesting. Good
to see that BA, because you mentioned the 74s, British Airways are going to paint one of the 74s up, or maybe not just that one, but a few others also in classic livery, celebrating what? Is it their 100th anniversary? Or is it their 90th? I think it's their 90th.
Yes, I don't think it's their 100th.
No, but they're getting close to that. Well, 10 years. Though they're painting up one of the 74s in the classic BOAC livery. I think it's a fantastic idea. But, one thing I really want to see, I don't want to see grey paint underneath. I want to see the metal, right? Just like the originals.
Yeah, if they polish it up, yeah.
I'll know if they're serious. If it's the PR department, they won't have polished metal. But if it's someone who really knows something about the history, they will, and it will look great if that's done that way.
Yeah, it would look fantastic, wouldn't it?
But I got a feeling they won't.
Well, give them a chance. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll give them a chance, but, it's almost like, that will be the litmus authenticity test for me.
The litmus test for me, authenticity, will be when British Airways starts doing flights like Melbourne, Singapore, Colombo, Egypt.
Like the good old days, running flying boats down to South Africa.
Yeah, that would be a very good thing.
Oh, I see that. Anyway. Speaking of long ranges over water, just quickly, Air Tahiti Nui saying possible Tahiti-Paris direct flights, Papa Iti Paris direct on the Dash 9.
It's only 200 nautical miles further than Perth, London.
Wow, okay, so not much.
Not a whole lot further, which made me run for Great Circle Mapper. It'd be load restricted and all that type of thing, but yeah, possible. And think what they could do with the ultra long range A350 then, because there's basically no limit to that thing.
Well, I see that the Alliance Airlines are flying now to Port Moresby. They've taken over the Virgin route and they're flying on behalf of Virgin, and that's Fokker 100s. That
airline I flew to. Hang on, Paul. What airline did I fly?
I don't know. You were on it.
Air North.
Oh, yes. You mentioned the Embraer, yeah.
And the Air North flight I took to Dili in East Timor, that was actually operated on behalf of Qantas.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
How big's Air North? If they've got regional jets, they're reasonable size, obviously.
Not very big. That's their only international flight. But they've got a couple of Embraers and propliners, and they do a lot around Western Australia and up into Northern Australia. They also do the flights to Toowoomba.
Okay. I remember Kiwi operator Peter Vincent Aviation, had that contract flying, I think, Darwin, East Timor in the early days after the troubles there. When were they?
It was really
in the late 90s?
It was
or
really
2000s?
busy. About 10 years ago. It's when it all started winding down. They got independence 20 years ago now.
Right. Other news here, the Airways Corporation are struggling to find air traffic controllers. They're saying that air traffic controllers can earn in excess of $95,000 in their first year, yet despite the lucrative income, finding the right candidates to fill the role across New Zealand airspace isn't as easy as you might think, they're saying here. And they're saying that you don't need a degree or any experience in a similar field. You just pass the test and they train you, you get there. We hear a lot about pilot shortages and those sorts of shortages, but I mean, if you don't have enough air traffic controllers, what do? Go AI?
I suspect that sooner or later they'll get this direct flight thing up and running, and there'll be enough smarts on the aircraft with some slight ground assistance for them to sort out their routings and everything all themselves. The Americans have calculated the fuel saving, and that's enormous.
Wow, yeah, I can imagine. I see on the latest 787. The one I saw, the video was the Dash 10, but I guess it's across the fleet software, is that now on the moving map you can see the position of every aircraft around you for, 200 or 300 miles, so you're like looking at a controller's screen in the cockpit.
So they've obviously got a connection to Flight Radar 24 going now.
You'd hope it would be a bit more solid than that.
It wouldn't surprise me if they just did a deal with Flight Radar 24. You know what these people are like, eh?
The thing is, though, who needs controllers when you've got that in front of you? And you've got automation working in concert with it,
Yeah, this has always been the premise behind the idea that the FAA had like 25 years ago called direct flight. Every time they froze a technological platform, it was outdated 2 years later.
Right.
But basically, in an ideal world, what would happen is you say, I'm Delta, I've got this slot here, I'm leaving now, and then there would be sort of an open negotiation between everyone else who might want that slot, who's flying that direction, blah, 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 and you'll be given the best route to get you there with the least fuel and the best chance of an on-time arrival.
Yeah. And I guess,
or an early arrival, and you can swap slots with other people. So all this having to delay to keep your slot, it would all be negotiated.
And
so you might say, no,
it's dynamic in real time, right? You can update as you're getting there, yeah, exactly.
Yes, so that's the dream. Whether or not they'll get there.
Judy McGrody of the Airways Corporation says of the 600 to 700 that will apply, they'd look to have about 24 people to the assessment centre and then only 12 into training. So you can see why it's not so easy.
Sounds pretty hard.
Just another reason to automate, maybe. Yeah.
Possibly, yeah.
Interesting story, Martin, in the latest Australian aviation magazine. Presume it's in the magazine, certainly on the website. And it's a big a piece on the Pratt & Whitney geared turbofans. Quite an interesting thing. And they're talking about the difference in bypass ratio from the first generation J57s, 1.5 to 1 bypass ratio, up to 12 to 1 on the geared turbofan. It's interesting to read what they say, or the manufacturer says, and the problems they've had with the engine. Nothing at all to do with the gearbox. That's never been a problem.
I've been following that quite closely, and turns out they're good at designing gearboxes. And good at designing gearboxes that can handle enormous amounts of power. It's all been more along the seals and the combustors and in the fuel system that have been causing the problem.
Yeah, so that's good to know, and that must give them a lot of confidence, because it would be a completely different story if it was the gearbox constantly giving problems. That could end it. That could end it.
Although it does make noises, different noises, which is confounding a few people. It's not too loud. It's just a different noise.
The Deputy Vice President for Asia Pacific Sales at Pratt & Whitney, Jeffrey Miner is his name. And he says, we've tested over 200,000 cycles in validation testing. We've done many, many things to create severe operating environments and put severe loads on the system. And of the core engine, he says, the turbine section, they were able to optimize the speed of the modules, whatever that means. And the shaft is common from the back end to the front end of the engine, so all the modules are limited by the speed of the common shaft. The introduction of a reduction gear in the front to slow the fan down means we can get more optimal speed and performance out of the turbine section, out of the compressor section. What he's saying is the hot bit's a lot more efficient, and the fan, both as a package. That's where you're getting the savings.
Well, what it lets them do is it lets them run a smaller, much hotter turbine engine section, and a lot simpler because they reckon they can do it all with one shaft. And then you've got the gearbox and you've got a slow-running fan off a very, very fast-running and very, very hot turbine section.
Yeah.
And, of course, with a jet, the hotter they run, the less fuel they use, as opposed to the previous designs, which are two-shaft, or with Rolls-Royce three-shaft, where they had concentric shafts running within each other so that each part of the engine could run on its own optimal speed.
Yeah.
Which has added a lot of complexity. And the gear turbofan, it's not the first gear turbofan. The first one was on the BAE 146s. They were a gear turbofan as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
right.
They
never had gearbox problems.
They were Lycoming engines converted from helicopter use, weren't they, originally?
Yeah.
Hair dryers, people used to call them.
Yes, but they were geared, and the gearbox, again, never gave any issues.
No, they were quite reliable. Though there was that thrust, what do they call it, reduction problem they had with a few of them at altitude,
they were nightmares in many other respects, and, blowing exhaust gas into the cabin system and all this type of thing. But
making the crew sick. Yeah, I remember reading those stories. They're looking to take the bypass ratio, it says here, to 15-1.
Yeah.
And try and obviously build it out and put it on bigger planes. But anyway, that's relevant because Air New Zealand are flying those engines right now.
And it's interesting that Rolls-Royce, Pratt & Whitney and Rolls-Royce have always had quite a lot to do with each other, and especially the V2500 series engines. That was a joint venture, and Rolls-Royce got out of that partnership and gave it all to Pratt & Whitney in exchange for the rights to use the gearbox technology on engines above 50,000 pounds thrust.
So that'll be the next.
That'll be the next. So, this is where Boeing, where Rolls-Royce is still talking about the UltraFan and the open fan. So one is like a 20-1 bypass ratio, but still with a nacelle, and the other one's the open rotor, which is just like they tried to get going in the 80s, but they couldn't because of the noise.
Here's a really interesting statistic that this chap from Pratt & Whitney has been quoted as saying, if you're burning less fuel, you are emitting that much less CO2. Well, it's obvious. One aircraft flying for a year, 2,200 flights, 3,600-ton reduction in fuel equates to planting over 900,000 trees. The annual aircraft savings from a cash operating cost perspective, about $1 million per aircraft. Wow.
There you go.
So if you had, 50 A321s or 320s with that engine on, that's a huge saving. It is. Yeah. All right, so it'll be interesting to follow how that engine does in service locally. We haven't heard anything so far, so...
Seems to be chugging along.
Just a couple of quick other stories. I see the first 767s KCs have landed at McConnell Air Force Base, delivered to the Air Force, and Airbus are opening up a second production line in Mobile, Alabama. I think they think that they're going to be still making a tanker for the U.S. Air Force. I wonder what's going to happen.
Yeah, interesting, eh? Who's Airbus partnered with? It's with Northrop. No, it's with Lockheed Martin.
Lockheed, and they're seriously big.
Yeah. And they'll always get something because, they're one of those companies which I've never understood, too big to fail, and they'll always get some business out of the U.S. government.
They've delivered 109 Airbus aircraft from that plant so far in 3 years, 109.
It's going pretty quick.
I guess you could make an argument that that is an American-built plane.
It is. Yes. Yeah. The vast majority of it comes from American suppliers and factories, raw materials even.
Yeah, so if, Make America Great Again and supporting American businesses would then naturally also have to extend to something like that, which is perceived to be a European business, not an American business. So I wonder how that'll go.
I think it's considered an American business, the Mobile, Alabama plant.
Because they won the contract, right? And then they lost it.
Yeah.
And it went to the 76, which is an inferior aircraft for that job. I mean, let's all be honest. And one of the main arguments at the time was that it was politically unacceptable to have a European country supplying this sort of equipment to the US military and, America first.
Yeah, and then, the political context of the time and everything, that's an argument that would work, but it won't necessarily work the second time.
Mm.
Especially if Boeing can't get their fly-by-wire remotely operated boom working, which it doesn't appear that they can.
Yes, I noticed there was no place for the boomer to sit.
Yeah, whereas the remotely operated boom on the A330 has been working for some time, though it does occasionally fall off.
Oh, has that happened? I hadn't seen that.
Yeah, they lost a boom in testing.
Oh, well, best that it happens in testing.
Not a good look.
No, it's like, whoops.
I forgot to fasten it on.
Where's the boom? Yeah. I mean, it's a big deal because they're going to order hundreds.
I must admit, when I watched the Twitter, there was a video on Twitter. It looked like a sort of 1980s promo video watching a 767-200 take off again.
Yeah, I know. I mean, they're nice looking, but they're old. They're late 70s design. That's what they are.
Yeah. No, it was funny.
It's remarkable, actually, that Boeing have kept that line going so long because they're delivering new freighters as well, aren't they, to FedEx? And they've had a good... They
must be dirt cheap, eh? And you do wonder whether if they'd done an Airbus 5 or 6 years ago and made a 767-200 Neo much lighter with modern engines, whether that wouldn't have filled their middle of the market, because the seating arrangement's perfect. I've always liked flying in them. I could imagine for short hops. What's the maximum seating? Like it's just like an A310, isn't it? So 210, 220,
something like
260.
That. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
They're quite, they're quite capacious, really.
Yeah. I'm very interested in seeing what Boeing come up with the 797, because it seems that everything they say or do, they get boxed in by the A321 argument.
Yeah.
It's going to be very interesting in the next couple of years when that starts getting announced, when they start rolling out the concepts.
Though Boeing delivered more aircraft in 2018 than Airbus.
There's a lot of talk about that, and I'm like, but you're still talking thousands each. Who cares?
Yeah. Yeah, it's just on the edges, on the margins, really, that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's not like one delivered 1,000, the other one delivered 40. The numbers are vast and very close.
Yeah.
And in narrow bodies, I mean, Airbus has got a problem. They don't seem to be doing that well in the big planes, although they reckon this year and next year, as the A350 ramp-up continues, they'll claw a lot of that back because 777 classics will start falling off. It'll take a while for the new 777Xs to ramp up. So during that time, Airbus will sell a lot more wide bodies. So they think the numbers will be, and certainly in wide bodies, will be reversed this year and next year. But the one problem Boeing's got is Airbus is slaughtering them on the single aisles.
Yeah.
Especially that A321. That's a scary thing. When Boeing announced the 797, I wonder how close it will be to a 767-200.
Well, that's about the size range. That's about the spot on the range, isn't it, that they want to be taking?
But as a lot of people say, you do get to the problem. So we want to build a plane that takes, let's say, 260 to let's call it 260 people, 2,000 miles, because the vast majority of journeys are going to be less than 2,000 miles. Yes, there are intercontinental flights, but that's covered. There's lots of planes to do that. So you're looking for a very efficient, mid-size, middle of the market, 260-seater. The trouble is, in all the analysis that I've looked at and been reading, and this really interests me, so I've been chasing it up, if you go with a plane that has 2 aisles, you've just got too much plane. You're flying around too much plane that you just don't need, that's inefficient simply from the space available at that range, because you could do it simpler with a single-aisle plane.
Yeah. Well, maybe that middle of the market really doesn't exist anymore.
Perhaps, but then Boeing have got a problem because they've been talking it up, and that maybe they were coming to the same conclusion. Maybe they're thinking, geez, you know what? We'd just be better off coming out with a whole new range of single aisles.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that might happen with Embraer.
They've got to do something because the 737 is getting old and it's beginning to look it.
Speaking of Boeing, their autonomous passenger air vehicle took to the skies, and that's a successful test. Range of 50 miles.
Yeah. Did you see the first flight? It got up to about a meter.
No, I didn't. I'm only looking at a picture here where it's still on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, well, then it didn't get much further than that. It went up about a meter and then went down again. That was it.
But that surely is successful in some sort of way.
Well, it left the ground.
Can you really see this, forgive the pun, taking off? Really?
No.
Can you see a sky? First of all, it's going to be a polluted sky. If you're going to see thousands of these things whizzing around all over the place, the visual pollution is going to be totally excessive. Presumably there'll be more noise. And, the safety issue is there. Aren't there better ways to, with trains and railway systems and stuff to still get mass transport going? I mean, this is, I don't know what to make of it.
I think it's garbage.
Okay, straight to the point.
I just don't think they'll get it safe enough that the people think, I'm going to jump in a little electric buggy and fly 30 miles. Or the safety constraints around it will have to be so much that, we're not flying today because we saw a bat or it's a bit windy or whatever. It'll be a tiny little niche market that some places, maybe like the Maldives might do it between islands or something like this.
Right.
But I don't see people doing it around Manhattan.
The weather point is a good one. What do you do if it's foggy? What do you do if there's a lot of wind around? What do you do if you hit extreme turbulence? A lot of what ifs. And you've just got to hope that the machine can cope. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're not a fan of that? We're not a fan?
No.
All right. So coming up, that interview with Andrew Russell about Continental Flight 11 that blew up over the United States back in 62. It's an interesting story. It's coming up in a moment. Maybe we can talk about some of the points that come out of that interview next program, Martin. But I should update everybody on Bring Our Birds Home, shouldn't I? You'd be keen. You'd be interested to know the latest. Obviously, the country's been in a bit of a shutdown mode over the Christmas, New Year holiday period, as we all know. Things are starting to happen again now, of course. The country's back up and running. So we are still waiting for it sounds like a stuck record, but it's just the way it is, the official sign-off to be able to purchase this DC-8 airframe. I know it's going to happen. It's just time, and I think with the new president and new administration, I pick up from our guy in Brazil, Caesar, that there's a way more business-friendly attitude now already, and it's only been, a month or two since the guy was elected president, Bolsonaro. So
it's all happening, is it?
So it's all happening. Things are speeding up. There's quite a sense of optimism, it seems, coming through, though a terrible disaster over the weekend there with the iron ore mine spilling like that, horrible thing. So we're waiting for that. And at that point, I'm pushing the big fundraising button. We have 3,000 followers on our Facebook page through social media, just that part of it. And, of course, we've got our Give a Little. So as soon as we have that clearance, we're into a full-on mode there. I think we finished the year with good news through from Cuba. We got a call from the Cuban ambassador to New Zealand saying that he had spoken to the officials in Cuba now, thanks to Steve Wild and his visit back in September, sort of closed the circle on that, that we have a deal where, I'll come out and say it now, if we replace that airframe that's sitting there at Havana with another sort of equivalent airframe, they will give us the DC-10.
Oh, wow.
Now, I think that's eminently doable.
Yeah.
There's a lot of aircraft going to the desert all the time. Many of them aren't being parted out. They're just being, destroyed, basically stripped back to the bare metal and melted down. So, what's the difference of sending something to Victorville or Mojave or sending it to Havana? Now, there are some options we've looked at that are some quite close to home to do this sort of deal, some not so close to home. But we're going to be working on that. And the reason they want to swap it out is because Cuba is obviously a country pretty well out on its own, given the history. And to have their fire people and security people, their emergency people, train some other location is very problematic for them. So they have to do it locally, and they can't maintain their certification as an international airport to operate day to day without ticking those boxes, doing that training for which they need that airframe. I completely understand that. I suspect it's not used that much because you can sort of see the condition of it, but they say that's what it's there for, and they have to be able to continue to do that, and obviously we'll need something to replace it. So we're going to be working on that, Martin, and I think that would be a pretty good deal. It's a great swap. They're not asking for money, they just want to swap.
Pretty cool.
Yep, and we're working on putting our dismantling team together. I'm in discussions with now a Polytechnic Institute that have an engineering faculty, talking about how we can bring a team together and give an experience to people doing engineering studies. Wouldn't that be amazing, don't you think? You're an engineer.
That would be.
In exotic locations, and already I know that the cost of doing it this way compared to the quotes I've had, or we've had, we, to have it done by existing companies who do this out there in the world, though usually to recover and to restore aircraft that are in trouble, not to, dismantle them once and for all. I know that we're going to be able to do it for way cheaper. So that's an interesting sort of spin-off from the whole thing. And we're off in March. I'm going with the Wanaka National Transport and Toy Museum people over to Australia, because we're recovering these aircraft from a museum that's gone belly up, including the Hawker Siddeley 748. And this is going to be an interesting experience because we're using this as a forerunner to see how much we can container ship, right, when it comes to it, because everything, I think there are 12 aircraft in all coming back. Some are small, obviously, but some are airliners coming back to the South Island, and that'll be a great sort of test run for the bigger project of recovering all the dismantled items of larger airliners. So, I think it's going to all happen this year, Martin, though I say that every year, but you got to say that every year.
You got to keep on it.
Keep on it, but one thing's for sure, we can buy the planes. Before, we couldn't buy them. Now we basically can. We've got deals on the 3 derelicts, know the prices of them. We know what we have to do. I think that's a great advancement. So I think this year, I'm not going to try and predict when in the year, but I think this year we'll have at least 1 or 2 of those nailed. And I'd like to see some parts coming back. Certainly we'll have the JT8D jet engines coming back to New Zealand pretty soon, and I want to have them on display somewhere, and there's some interest in that. Been looking at that for a while. So that's all good. So Bring Our Birds Home is in good shape, but I know that the people who have been supporting us will realise that we've done the hard yards. We've got to a very good point in the whole thing, and I think that they'll be willing to support the next bit, which is actually buying and securing the airframes, not necessarily transporting them, but buying them and getting into an ownership situation to really head off any problems in the future. I think people will support that. So, as I say, I think 2019 will be a good year. And, of course, you'll be making a donation or two to the cause through this year. Martin, I know you will.
You'll have to stop me, Paul. It'll be hard.
In fact, something out of the pay packet every fortnight would be brilliant, but no.
If I had a pay packet, that'd be great.
No, I know you're not. Yeah, I know. Yeah, fair enough. Tell me about it. No, I think people will know that we've, like I say, done the hard yards and really made it happen from nothing, and I'm looking forward to their support. And if they don't, well, at least we tried is always the default position. At least we tried.
You gave it a go, and the best of luck. See how it works out.
We gave it a crack, I think they say.
Yeah.
Anything else that we should be mentioning before we hear from Andrew Russell about Continental Flight 11? You'll be curious about this. 707 that was blown up over rural Iowa in 62, I think it was. And it's quite an interesting story, what happened, because I hadn't heard about it. I know about the Flight 11 that went into the World Trade Center. It was one of the flight numbers of the aircraft that, 9/11, but I hadn't heard of that one. So we'll hear about that, and we'll get together in the next week or so for another podcast. What do you reckon?
Yes. Next week I'm going to basically recite a long list of YouTube channels, which I think people should be watching.
Okay. Anyway, Good to talk. And if anyone has any ideas for any of the programs or content or interview leads or anything, get in touch. It'll be great. Till again, Martin, good to talk.
Yes, and you too. See you later.
All right, it's time for the interview on the New Zealand Aviation Podcast for this episode. We're talking with Kiwi Andrew Russell, who's written a book called The Missouri Crash, The Bombing of a Continental Airlines 707. It's available through Amazon and the usual outlets in the various forms, and he'll talk about how you can go about getting a copy of the book at the end of the interview. Andrew Russell, thank you for joining the New Zealand Aviation Podcast to talk about Continental Airlines Flight 11. First of all, what got you interested in this, and are you an aviation enthusiast by default, or is this, a particular incident that has your specific interest?
Oh, well, thanks for having me, first off. But yeah, to be fair, I was always an aviation enthusiast. I very fondly remember flying a lot as a child, and then obviously right through till present day, so 33 years basically of flying.
Mm-hmm.
And I have really just a sort of I don't know, I wouldn't quite call it an obsession, but I'm definitely an enthusiast.
Right.
It was just a natural thing for me to be inquiring about various incidents and, Googling wasn't around back then when I discovered the crash, but search engines and such. So it came about after 9/11, after the terror attacks, actually, on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and the hijacked flights. And, of course, one of those was Flight 11. And There was an article in, I think it was the New York Post, about Flight 11 being an unlucky number. And it actually included Continental Airlines Flight 11. And I thought, well, that is not something I've ever heard of. And it said how it had been subject to a domestic terrorist attack, is basically what they called it at that time. And I never thought anything more about it. Really, until 2007. So that was 2001. I discovered it, read about it, brought up a accident report on it from the FAA archives site. And then 6 years later, I was at uni doing media studies, a Bachelor of Media Studies, and they said, well, you need to do a blog on something. Oh. And I had a separate aviation blog going. Much like some of the ones that you see around New Zealand, like the Third Level Aviation and NZ Civil Blogspot and those sorts of sites. And I started a Continental Airlines Flight 11 blog, and I thought this will be a complete waste of time. No one's ever going to discover it. It'll just sit there idle. And then I started getting posts from people who were actually involved directly with it.
Wow. Yeah, we know about many of the crashes and incidents over the history of all of this. There are the high-profile ones, not so high-profile. I got to say, I hadn't come across this. I'm sure a lot of people would say that. Why do you think this particular, well, would you call it a crash, terror attack, why has this gone under the radar, I wonder, the way it has?
Well, no. Yeah, well, it's a question I've asked now, Paul, for probably the last 18 years, ever since I came across the accident report. And the accident report's quite fascinating because it actually was overseen by Mark Felt, who later went on to Watergate fame. Right. Obviously, the FBI became involved with the Civil Aeronautics Board, which, of course, was the precursor to the current NTSB. And at that point, for some reason, after 1962, it just seems to have been filed away in the FBI case closed files, and no one spoke about it. And I think a lot of the people involved with it who lost loved ones on the flight were told, you don't talk about this sort of thing. Your father passed away. That is all you need to know. Let's carry on as if nothing happened. And yet, of course, there are earlier crashes from the 40s, 50s and 60s that haven't been forgotten. But for whatever reason, I think because the FBI was so heavily involved, it's almost like no one can really get the files, almost. That's what I've heard from relatives of those who perished. It's been a locked down case almost.
Wow.
Since that time.
Okay, so we're May 1962, and the aircraft, it's a Continental Airlines 707, so pretty early 707, registration N70775, and it was operating actually this aircraft has a bit of history. We can talk about that, and again, I would say in these cases, quite often you'll find that the aircraft sort of has form. It has a bit of history. I don't know if there's ever a connection, but quite often it seems to be that way. But this aircraft was just operating a normal domestic transcontinental flight, right? That nothing special about what was about to happen.
Nothing too unusual. It was doing Chicago to Los Angeles via Kansas City. And the flight was actually known as the Champagne Flight. Literally, they fed champagne to everyone on board. It was a evening cocktail service out of Chicago. It was scheduled to leave about 8:15. It got away at 8:35 that evening, and by about 9:15 had more or less been blown apart over rural Iowa and Missouri. But nothing spectacular or interesting about the flight, certainly when it left the ground. There were 2 late-running passengers that they put the stairs back up for. Of course, this is pre-jet bridge era.
Yeah.
And the 2 people who were late were actually the people who, the gentleman certainly was the one who ended up blowing the aircraft up on its first leg. And the woman with him was actually his business partner and his, how do we say this nicely in this era, was his love interest at the time.
Right. Okay. So now it is, you mentioned the word terrorist attack or terror, and it sort of filed under that, but it kind of isn't because, okay, who is this individual? And I'm wondering if the people with him knew what was about to happen, but who was this individual and what was his plan?
Yeah, well, I mean, domestic terrorist is kind of a 2000s buzzword, but I think for him in the day, I mean, I think really what he was a very, he was Thomas Doty, and he had started a cosmetics business which had failed, and he owed quite a bit of money, and he was in with a business partner of his, a lady called Geneva Fraley. Now, both of these individuals were married to other people. It was widely speculated at the time that not only were they business partners, but they were also involved in a tryst. And he had obviously fallen on hard times, Mr. Doty, and he had robbed a woman with a gun in Kansas City, Missouri. And he was due to appear in court the week after the explosion, essentially the downing of the aircraft. He had purchased dynamite sticks, and receipts were found for those in his home when the FBI later searched it. And he had walked on to the 707 with $250,000 worth of life insurance and intended to blow it up, which he did. He lit the dynamite in the right rear lavatory. They knew it was him because of the dynamite receipts, and because when they found the body, of course, he was the only one, along with one of the stewardesses, who had dynamite residue on him. And, of course, he was one of the bodies that had been sucked out of the aircraft and the tail fell off. So he was pinpointed as being of that disposition. Of course, he had the court case coming up. He was on bail for that. And really, you know, with the debts that he had, it was concluded that he had done it. Whether his business partner, Mrs. Fraley, knew anything about it, we will never know. She didn't appear to be aware of the fact of what he was going to do that evening. And I think if she had, I'm sure she wouldn't have got on.
So he was wanting to presumably his family to claim the life insurance. Was that the plan?
That was, yes. And in fact, the family did try and claim the life insurance. And I think in the end, the only thing the widow got was a $3.50 refund on the postage that she had used to actually put the claim in. And the admin fee back then and all that was about $3.50. So she got a refund on that, but she never got the insurance because, of course, the FBI had said, well, we're 99.99% certain that your husband actually was the cause of the crash. And I interviewed a gentleman who had actually played poker with Doty in the 50s.
Wow.
And he often said that if he wasn't a millionaire by the time he was 35, he'd kill himself. Oh. And he was 34 when he went down with the aircraft, when he blew himself up.
Wow. You never know who's about to get on the plane, do you? Okay.
No.
Let's talk about the actual aircraft, 707 Continental Airlines, and I mentioned it had some history. So dial back about a year before this happened in 1962, and I think it was hijacked, wasn't it?
It was. It was a father and son who wanted to take it to Cuba, and ironically the plane was actually meant for Cubana, but Cubana Airlines never took up the aircraft when it went to Continental. But it was a 59 model, and the 2 gentlemen on board wanted to go to Cuba. I think they'd taken off from Los Angeles en route to Texas, to El Paso. They landed at El Paso. They wanted to go to Cuba. In El Paso, the 2 were taken out by essentially the G-men of the day, the FBI of the day. And the aircraft actually did receive some damage from stray bullets. The tyres were shot out, and there was some fuselage damage from bullets.
Right.
And it had from a stewardess former stewardess that I interviewed in 2013. She had been on the aircraft numerous times, and it had always been joked that it was the hangar queen. It had never performed as a 707 should perform. It always, pilots didn't like that particular Regio. They always say there's sort of a lemon in the fleet. Well, that was the lemon.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, okay, he went to the rear lavatory and you said lit the dynamite. That's very sort of old school, isn't it? Sort of like lighting the fuse.
Very much. Very much so. He lit the fuse and the explosion occurred at around 9:15. There was a B-47 that was flying in the vicinity at the time, saw the explosion that had flown out of somewhere in Missouri and was heading north towards Des Moines in Iowa. The aircraft itself had been avoiding thunderstorms and tornado reports that evening, actually, around the Iowa-Missouri border, and the weather had been horrendous that evening. And the captain had climbed all the way to 39,000 to actually avoid it. I mean, for a 1-hour flight, that was quite a high altitude to get to. And just as they were starting their descent for Kansas City, it's just on the Iowa-Missouri border, which is about a 2-hour drive south of Des Moines and about 45 minutes drive west of Kirksville, Missouri, which is the nearest sort of airport these days. But the aircraft, the dynamite went off. The aircraft depressurized. There was a hole in the side initially, it's thought. The crew had donned oxygen masks and had got out the emergency checklist. The gear was down and locked. And unfortunately, no Mayday call was ever received. The tail broke off within the first few seconds of the decompression. And the aircraft pitched nose down, and the engines actually disappeared as well. They were found a mile further on from the actual wreckage. The engines had been flung off with the impact of the descent. They'd actually fallen off. And the aircraft had more or less sort of cartwheeled itself into the ground. It just spun out of control at that point and hit the ground about 6 miles northwest of Unionville, Missouri, which is a town around then was around 2,000 people. It's now about 1,200 people. Very rural, remote, small town. And people in the town that night thought it was thunder that had returned from the storms earlier, but it was actually the aircraft exploding the dynamite exploding, and then it was the wreckage actually slamming into an alfalfa field.
Crikey. And not much chance of surviving that. 45, I think, on board. I don't know if that was the passenger number or the total number, but
45 total.
There was an individual, I think I read, who actually survived the crash but died at the scene or soon afterwards.
Yes, Takahiko Nakano. He was a Japanese national who was actually living in Chicago. We don't know why he was on the plane, although I have spoken to his family since. I actually had a Japanese friend do the translating for me, and they finally came forward last year. In fact, I got the email from them literally as I hopped off a plane in Los Angeles last year, which I find a little bit spooky. But very odd timing. But he survived for about 90 minutes.
Wow.
He was taken to a hospital in Iowa, but he died literally upon arrival there. And they told him what had happened, and he went into shock and died.
Oh, crikey!
But apparently there were no specific injuries that they could find on him. He'd actually he was still strapped into his seat, and he was on top of basically of other passengers, unfortunately, and bits of wreckage and suitcases. He had fallen through the cabin floor and kind of into the baggage compartment. The wreckage was fairly intact, and it's often speculated that the aircraft entered such a strange pitch that its forward speed actually diminished towards the ground, and it was in such a dead stall, it sort of fell straight down at some point after it had done its spinning. But again, that's speculation because, of course, in those days, the flight data recorder, cockpit voice recorder, all that, they didn't have a cockpit voice recorder. And the flight data recorder was fairly, speculative. It was very imprecise information.
So it wouldn't have been a very difficult job for the investigators to work out what happened. And as you say, they were able to go all the way to the person who did it, got all the evidence. I don't think you said it was covered up, but it was sort of buried. And again, you come to that question, why would it have been buried? Were they worried at that time that there could be copycats or...
I think they were. I think it's often been... I actually spoke to the captain's daughter, Captain Fred Gray, who was the CEO's best friend, actually, literally. Who at the time was Bob Six, who was one of the old mavericks of aviation, and he'd taken over Continental as the president and the CEO since it was Varney Speedlines in the 30s. So he went right back.
Yeah.
And Captain Fred Gray's daughter often speculated that there was fear of copycat, and there was fear, I think, in the 60s that someone would sort of see him as not a martyr, but, at the time, you've got to remember there were a lot of desperate people. You had the McCarthy trials from less than a decade earlier, and you had a very jittery America with in the early 60s, and I just think a lot of things like that were often papered over simply because they were scared of a copycat, I think, at that time, especially with no security, and you wandered onto the aircraft, you boarded via the stairs, and off you went.
Gosh, the level of trust that used to exist is just mind-blowing compared to today, right?
Oh yes, and I actually stayed with the son of the man who put the stairs back up for the bomber.
Wow.
And, because back then customer service was everything. You didn't worry about OTPs, about on-time performance. You worried about the customer. And he actually put the stairs back up to that aircraft and saw them both board, and Fraley and Doty. And he had remembered the stewardess had actually brought him a cup of coffee from the forward galley. And she said, well, good night. We'll see you when we're next in Chicago. Here's a cup of coffee. And, of course, she shut the door. He pulled the stairs away, and the aircraft took off for the last time.
Wow.
And one of the stewardesses I interviewed, who was the one that told me the aircraft was unreliable, so to speak, she had actually seen the crew that night. She'd got into Chicago, and she was actually meant to be on the aircraft. She'd swapped with a friend.
Wow.
And the friend ended up on the aircraft, and of course lost her life. But she actually said, good night, Freddie. Of course, that was the captain's name, Fred Gray. And she said, good night, Freddie, we'll see you in LA. And back then they used to send the Boeing 720, which was the faster version on the non-stops, to Los Angeles, because, of course, it was all a speed game back then, who could get there quicker.
Right.
Amongst the different airlines. And they sent the older, slower 707 via Kansas City. So there'd actually been a last-minute equipment change that night.
Right. Okay.
That plane was meant to go straight back to LA, but it actually ended up on the Kansas City run.
Yes, there's always a backstory operating. Yeah, those 720s, they were there for speed, weren't they? The 600 mile an hour plus.
They were.
The inboard wing was different, wasn't it? It was a different shape.
It was, and they preferred working on it, actually. They said it just felt a little bit better. And it was a slightly newer airframe than the 707-100s, which a lot of the crew, they did, like I say, they did not like that particular rego. It just had a funny feeling, and I don't know whether they sort of speculated on that later or whether it really was true, but it was often said the 100 series was a bit of a dog out of the 707 family. Yeah,
it was underpowered and first generation. For someone like yourself and, what you're saying, you've obviously gone into it quite deeply. You've talked to the actual people, which is always an incredible thing to do because, that's so close to the story. What's that been like? And it sounds to me like from that blog that you set up initially, it's gone so deep, way more than you ever thought. Am I right?
Oh, it's insane. And, I'm sitting here 12 years on and think from when the blog was started, and I'm thinking, wow, how the heck did that happen? And I've got emails that came in and blog posts that were quite shocking. And people saying, good morning, sir, I am the captain's daughter, and you get emails like that, and they pour out what had happened. And there's a lot of people got a phone call 2:00 in the morning from Continental to say, well, the aircraft is overdue. It never arrived in Kansas City. And there's a lot of personal information people have shared with me about their loss and about how they dealt with it, and a lot of criticism on Continental, actually. There was a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then that was about it. Because back then there was no victim support, there was no specialised team, and they were basically told, shut up and carry on, which I think sadly was a bit of the general attitude back in the 60s, especially in the States, which, back then was fairly conservative. Well, it still is a fairly conservative nation on the whole. But, these people were mainly Midwestern-based or some in LA. They moved on with life. But some of the emails I got, especially from former crew members who remembered some of the flight attendants, that was very, very heart-wrenching to read the stories about, they flattered together and some of the cocktail parties that the captain would have. And it sounded very much like the Dean Martin jet set, and it was.
Yeah, it was then. Yeah, it was. Yeah,
it was. And of course, for the families though who lost people, that was particularly horrendous. And there's a lot of details I received that, for me, of course, I was in my 20s at the time. It was quite a bit to swallow, and some very very nice emails from virtually complete strangers. Some telephone calls as well. People who'd played golf with the captain, or knew where he'd lived in Los Angeles, or people who'd known his wife, and people who'd flown on the aircraft. And a lot of Continental staff came forward, check-in agents, ticketing agents, people who actually remember checking people in that night for that flight in Chicago. And they came out of the woodwork. But the families, of course, have formed some very lasting bonds because of the blog and because of the memorial efforts themselves. That was just gigantic when that came out.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because I think at Unionville is where the memorial is. Correct me if I'm wrong. And there was an initial one, and there's been a more recently, I think in 2010. Again, I might be wrong with the day or the year.
2010 was the initial unveiling of the memorial stone in the middle of Unionville in the town square, actually. And I wasn't present for that, but 2012 I flew into Des Moines, actually, and ended up getting picked up and driving basically through cornfields for about 2.5 hours to this tiny little town, which no one had heard of. But that was 2012, was the 50th anniversary, and of course I was flown over especially for it by Dwayne Crawford. Now, Dwayne Crawford was in his 70s at the time, and he was a former Marine, and he had taken a big interest in the history of the area. And he had actually seen my blog post and got in contact with me in 2008. And from there, it went on, and he said, look, I'm going to get this darn thing built. And he did. He went out and contacted all the families. And, of course, because he was in his 70s, he'd never used Blogger. But I was kind of the go-between between family members, and I passed their details on to him, and then he'd call them up on the old-fashioned telephone. And, of course, from there, that's where the memorial stone idea came from, was to get a memorial going. And then, of course, they had the big unveiling in 2010, and then 2 years later I was over there, and that was very strange, actually, meeting these people. Very, very strange. And they'd never heard my accent was completely foreign. It was a shock.
It's a kind of crazy situation, because here you've got someone from the other side of the world with no connection that you would ever
none at all
realize, or could make, and yet this happens. It's kind of good that you can.
Well, it was bizarre. I think would bizarre, be the best. I mean, it's good, but it's still sort of. I still think, and I think about it, and I think, how on earth did that connection happen? Yeah. It is a very, very strange thing.
I was just thinking, as you're talking about the maybe the lack of empathy, institutional empathy in the day for people caught up in something like this, that it wasn't too long after the war, was it? 1962, you're within less than 2 decades after the war. A lot of people in commercial aviation at that time had their start in the war. And a lot of the pilots, a lot of the people who operated airlines were in the military, were in the air forces, and they were used to seeing their colleagues going off and not coming back, and they got hardened to it, didn't they? So I wonder if that played a part in that lack of empathy that came across in that way?
Well, quite possibly. I mean, I've spoken to some pilots they're now deceased who were flying at the time. They were in their late 90s when I talked to them, and they knew the crew very well. And I think their attitude was sort of, Freddie Gray bought his farm tonight, sort of thing, And it was a very militarial attitude towards it. They were cut up about it, but it wasn't something you spoke about after the funeral.
Well, you didn't need counselling. You just you staunchly, stoically got on with things.
Yeah, but I always think it's a bit sad that they, certainly for the 3 cockpit crew, that they had the gear down and had the checklists out.
Yeah.
Once you've lost that tail, you're over, really.
So they must have, if they were they were in the descent at the time, were they, when this happened?
Yeah, they were coming through 36,000 out of 39.
Okay, so that's very early to put gear out. So that must have been a very, urgent response to the situation.
Well, that's what's speculated because, I mean, again, there's no cockpit voice recorder, and there was no Mayday call, sadly, but from what I've read in the accident report, it's quite possible that they blacked out simply from the G-forces, right, from a very early stage, because that thing pitched so violently. I think they did the first couple of steps, and that was it. They were sort of interrupted really when the tail fell off.
Yeah.
But
yes, it overstressed.
Even the flaps were down. Yeah, it had shorn off really. And the tail was found in Centerville, Iowa, and the fuselage, of course, was in Unionville, Missouri, right over the border.
Yeah.
And the tail had come off very early on.
Right, and the engines had obviously advanced somehow, maybe fuel in the system, still some power, and, a crazy sort of gyrations, I think, have been described, obviously made it further than the wreckage. So,
yeah, they were found about 3/4 of a mile to a mile forward of the wreckage. Onwards from the wreckage. And they had dug themselves into the ground so deeply that they needed to get a digger in to actually get them out. They'd actually continued rotating right until impact.
Wow. Okay.
Which just sort of bamboozles me, but that's what was ruled at the time by the Civil Aeronautics Board.
As long as they've got fuel, they'll keep going. Yeah,
exactly. And the guy who found the wreckage in the wee small hours of the 23rd of May, I've interviewed him extensively. He's in his 70s now, so he's not too old. He was only a teenager at the time, but he came across the wreckage and he said it was the spookiest thing he had ever seen, this giant broken aircraft in the middle of a field in the moonlight.
Yeah.
The weather had cleared up by then, and they had a party line that was literally ringing red hot from the sheriff, and of course they could smell the gas in the air, and people's flight tickets were blowing around, and napkins, magazines. Someone actually found a champagne bottle that had not smashed. Oh, apparently, wow. I'd love to know how that happened, but they found a champagne bottle and a galley cut, and people realised, of course, what had happened up there. And then they came across the wreckage, and it was just absolute pandemonium descended, really, by daybreak.
Fascinating story, Andrew. Thanks for alerting us to it, and thanks for coming on our podcast and talking about it. And, for people who want to go find out more, the information is available. Now, there's a book that you've published, and it's called Missouri Crash, The Bombing of a Continental Airlines 707. How can people get to that?
They can get that on Amazon.com. There's a Kindle version, which is only about $2 US, and then there is the paperback version, which is about $9.50 US, and that's a paperback book with my mugshot on the back.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And the aircraft on the front, the graphic I'm looking at, is that the actual aircraft?
Well, we're 99% certain it is. I've had people tooth comb it, and they think it is. I don't know how they can think that, but that's what I've been told, that it is actually in 70775.
Right.
And that photo, we actually do not know where it came from. It literally turned up one day on the blog from an unknown poster, and we've never been able to trace its sources. So
funny that.
Yeah, very odd.
Another one of those things. Okay, well, I suggest if our listeners are interested, to go and pursue those links and find out and have a good read. And thank you again, Andrew, for coming on and talking about it.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.